May 9th. Moscow's biggest annual party, dating back decades in its original incarnation as a Victory Day parade to celebrate the Soviet Union's triumph over Germany in the Great Patriotic War. It is not just my favorite day on the Russian calendar for acquiring new B-roll. It has also been the subject of political intrigue in every iteration since the invasion began. I, for one, am old enough to remember the ridiculous media chatter in 2022, when people actually thought that Putin would use the opportunity to declare victory in Ukraine and withdraw to borders similar to the status quo beforehand. 48 months later, the war continues. And now most of the intrigue each year has turned to what Russia can still do with the parade, both due to a shortage of equipment thanks to attrition in eastern Ukraine, and increased security concerns from long-range drones and cruise missiles named after cute pink birds. And as we continue to enjoy this much more pleasant B-roll, let me transition to the much more serious topic of what could happen this year on May 9th. Speculation persists that Putin could be in the crosshairs this time around, amid the Kremlin openly announcing a scaled-back parade, and various reports of Putin increasing his general security apparatus. So, on tap for today, I want to focus on three things. First, we will cover a pair of short-term ceasefire proposals meant to guarantee a safe celebration in Moscow, which includes a humorous Ukrainian troll. Then we will get more serious by describing the strategy behind the general security problem, and what it says not only about attacks on Victory Day, but also what is happening right now. And finally, we will put this in the context of a broader report on what the regime's security situation looks like for Vladimir Putin. But let's start with the ceasefire nonsense. And let me preface this by saying that this conversation is going to be more silly than serious. Just as the parade is an annual tradition, so is Russia announcing a ceasefire to commemorate the Great Soviet Victory. Really, just a way to ensure that Putin can hold his parade without disruption. It will not shock you to learn that adherence to said ceasefires has been spotty at best. However, this year, Ukraine decided to do something funny. Earlier in the week, Zelensky announced that, sure, Russia could have its ceasefire. However, it will not start on May 9th. Rather, it will begin on May 6th. From then on, Ukraine would mirror Russia's actions. No firing at Ukraine, and then no firing at Russia. Tit for tat. Basically, Ukraine was trying to demonstrate the silliness of unilateral ceasefires. You do not just get to say that there is a ceasefire, and lo and behold, there is a ceasefire. Point taken, because Russia indeed continued the war as usual. So the speculation then turns to what Ukraine might do during Victory Day, amid Russia once again warning that there will be serious consequences if Ukraine disrupts the festivities in Moscow. Note to the Kremlin, and anyone else not following this larger war. What is Russia going to do? Invade Ukraine? Moscow has no extra cards in reserve, because everything is already played out, or is otherwise off the table because Beijing would not be pleased. You can't just threaten to win the war, because if you could, you would have done it already. Now, zooming out, I would describe this whole tit-for-tat ceasefire thing as a distraction. The Zelensky-mandated ceasefire has made the media rounds as a masterstroke, laying bare the Kremlin's hypocrisy on the ceasefire front. Be that as it may, it has virtually no tangible effect on the military situation, and I am not sure who, after 4 years, has not formed opinions on which side is in the right. So Ukraine has gained whatever utility may be in having a positive news cycle among war watchers. But the story of real importance is what happens on Victory Day, or right before Victory Day. So let's talk about that. Although Victory Day provides more appealing visuals to the general strategic problem of allocating defenses, this is still just a case of allocating defenses. You might recall how this works from some of our previous explorations of the dilemma, but let me offer a quick refresher. Suppose that Russia has a couple of potential defensive liabilities, each with a unique level of vulnerability, and a set of defensive resources that it can allocate to either of those locations. The key insight is that Russia should not evenly allocate the resources between the two. Rather, Russia should look at the relative vulnerability of the two locations, and allocate resources until the ultimate risk is even between the two. That is because if you overallocate to one of them, Ukraine simply strikes the more vulnerable of the two, and every defensive resource allocated to the other one was effectively meaningless. Now, imagine we suddenly had a third potential target conjured out of nowhere. That is, after all, the situation with the Victory Day parade. One day a year, there is another target that has no practical value, but suddenly becomes important for propaganda purposes. Never mind that a number of VIPs will be sitting out in the open on the streets of Moscow. Unfortunately for Russia, the existence of a parade does not also magically conjure a bunch of new security forces. Rather, the Kremlin is stuck with the same number of defenses that it had before, but now it has a new weak point to cover. Thus, Russia ends up diluting its defensive efforts elsewhere, again because it needs to even out the security vulnerabilities across all of the targets. There are three implications that arise from this that may not be immediately obvious. 1. The upshot for Ukraine is not the vulnerability of the parade itself. Rather, it is the lack of equivalent defensive resources to match, which makes the overall vulnerability of the other possible targets skyrocket. 2. Any speculation on what Ukraine could strike on May 9th needs to come with the appropriate level of humility. The level 1 strategic thought is that the parade is vulnerable, so obviously it will be the target. The level 2 strategic thought is that, because the Kremlin will want to protect the parade, obviously existing targets will be hit that day instead. The level 3 strategic thought is that this is all a push, because the optimal defensive allocations mandate that all targets be equivalently vulnerable. And the level 4 strategic thought is that Russia does not know Ukraine's exact capacity to strike any of those targets, and is thus trying to even out the vulnerability based on its best estimate of Ukraine's abilities. In turn, what determines Ukraine's ultimate target is indeed the information that only Kyiv knows. Consequently, it makes little sense for us to speculate on what the real target would be, because if we knew that information, certainly the Kremlin would know that information, and thus it is not actually private information as originally assumed. Finally, we are already seeing the benefit of the parade for Ukraine. Russia cannot snap its fingers and get all of the security systems put into place in Moscow at 8 a.m. on May 9th. Rather, the Kremlin has to start moving air defenses into position days ahead of time. That means existing targets, like Russian refineries, already have weakened security. You will note that Ukraine has correspondingly seen greater success in its launches recently, though it is hard to disaggregate the effect of Victory Day from a general state of Russian disrepair. Moving on to our final topic for the day, the parade, and the security situation around it, come at a time when it seems that Putin is increasingly worried about the stability of his regime. A leaked report began circulating among Western media outlets, allegedly from a European intelligence agency, suggesting that the Kremlin is in more trouble than is publicly understood. To summarize some of the headline claims, anyone who has interactions with Putin is under heightened surveillance. Putin is spending less time in a bunker in Moscow and more time in a bunker in Krasnodar, and former Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu is central to a potential coup plot. Let's spend a moment putting each of these points in the proper context. I am not sure why the surveillance point has received as much attention as it has, because it reads like paranoid autocrat engages in traditional paranoid autocrat behavior. To connect this back to Victory Day, Russia again is not holding its Immortal Regiment march, because that would involve having a bunch of randos standing near Putin. So I would say that this information is putting additional color onto a topic that we already knew to be true. The Krasnodar point is more interesting. It is here in the south of the country. Moscow is up here. They are roughly the same distance from Ukrainian-held territory, but the pathway to Krasnodar can fly over a whole bunch of defense-free water, whereas it is easier to naturally prune down drones headed to Moscow. This tells us that Putin is more worried about domestic threats than Ukrainian threats, or at the very least, he believes it is easier for Ukraine to recruit agents in Moscow than it is in southern Russia. It is also interesting that he believes being outside of the capital is better for regime security than being inside of the capital. This flips the general logic of how coups work. See, for example, Gorbachev's arrest at a dacha, where you hold him at bay, secure the government structure in the capital, and then declare the whole operation over. One way to make sense of today's situation is that Putin is more worried about attempts against his life than someone trying to usurp control through more traditional means. Regarding the coup threat, Shoigu is an interesting person to point the finger at. He and Putin have, or had, a close relationship, and you can find an endless stream of photos of them on vacation together. Part of the thinking about why Putin was so close to him is that Shoigu's father was ethnically from a Turkic group out of Siberia. Shoigu was therefore non-threatening, as the political power players in Moscow would not accept him as the new leader if he were to ever try to overthrow Putin. That is why he was Minister of Defense for so long, and even after the war proved him to be ineffective in that role, he moved to Secretary of the Security Council. But the intelligence report is saying that maybe he is a threat after all. Anyway, I think it is important to take a leaked intelligence report like this with a grain of salt. It is easy to fabricate the entire thing, release it to the public, and then watch Moscow react in paranoia. The alternative headline for this could be, "Intelligence Agency Possibly Runs Influence Operation." But I do not think that would get as many clicks. I also think that it is important to understand the general situation that Russia is currently in. I spent a full geopolitics helpline video discussing this on my secondary channel, but we still need to separate the "Putin is done" / "Russia is broken" clickbait from the reality of the situation. The Russian position looks substantially worse than it did a year ago, but there is a big difference between Russia being at a breaking point and the Kremlin having to rethink the economics of the war. Now, could there be a coup or some sort of protest movement on the streets of Moscow? Sure. But it is also important to understand the reality that these are still low likelihood events, and you should not trust commentators who have been saying that Russia is 2 weeks away from collapse for the last 2 years. I raise this point because it plays into what Ukraine should do with the opportunity that Victory Day affords it. By the "Putin is done" narrative, a public attack on the parade would be the final breaking point of the country. And I get why that narrative exists. It is the type of thing that you would see in a movie, so it is easy to think through a plausible way that one bomb on one parade could fall the entire country. But it could also just be a political black eye for Putin, which the Kremlin tries to salvage by portraying Ukrainians as savages, thereby renewing the need to put down Kyiv. To circle back to the defensive allocation problem, though, Russia should be evening out all of those risks. From our perspective as keyboard warriors, another attack on an oil refinery should have the same net expected war benefit as striking the parade. The fact that the latter would make for better B-roll gets offset by the greater concentration of defenses in the capital, and thus a lower Ukrainian chance of success there. So, what are our takeaway points for today? The dueling ceasefires was a humorous diversion that will not have much of a substantive effect on the war. The Victory Day parade is creating a security vulnerability for Russia, but the realized risk ultimately gets spread out to every other vulnerable facility in the country. And we ought to acknowledge, but not overreact to that new security report, just like every other big new war development. Meanwhile, if you want to learn more about the issues that come with crying wolf over the impending demise of Russia, and, incidentally, how to actually give Ukraine better political support, check out that Geopolitics Helpline video that I referenced earlier. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.